saw him is Eric Schmidt, who's the Executive Director at the Wildlife Protection Solutions in downtown Denver. It's a wonderful organization with its goal to protect wildlife that are becoming extinct so rapidly. Eric has a master's degree in conservation biology and worked for the U.S. National Renewable Energy Lab for a number of years with a focus on grassland flora and fauna, as well as mammal wildlife management. And then he took the leap into high tech, where he was a leader in enterprise software deployments for Fortune 500 companies. He blended those talents and went to Wildlife Protection Solutions, where he's been for some time. I can't remember, Eric, but I know you and I have seen each other at different events over the years. It's a wonderful organization, and I know this is going to be a wonderful presentation because I've experienced some of the things that Eric is going to be talking about. With that, Eric, if you want to add to what I said, please do. But of course, the information is available in our Lions, the Roarings.
Well, thank you very much, Lori and Fletcher. And thank you all. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here and tell you a little more about our organization, and more importantly about wildlife and what we're doing to enhance its safety globally. I'll take this opportunity now to go ahead and share my screen. And if everything is working correctly, you should see a WPS logo. Is that coming through okay? All right.
Eric, if you just 1 second, please everybody go to mute so it doesn't flash differently. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're off to a good start with the technology, so that always helps. Usually I like to take a step back before jumping into the specifics of what WPS does and set the table a little bit to kind of give people some context about the situation of endangered species globally. And I find that when I'm talking with a lot of folks, they have a pretty keen understanding of some of the situations that endangered species are faced with. So if you think about them, you probably think of things like rhinos, tigers, polar bears, humpback whales, elephants, you know, this big charismatic megafauna. But a lot of people don't necessarily know beyond the fact that these animals may need our help to the specifics related to each one. For example, there are some 3,200 tigers left in the wild in the world, around 20,000 rhinos, white rhinos, a similar number of polar bears, humpback whales, around 80,000. And according to the Gray Elephant census a few years ago, around 350,000 African elephants on the continent roaming wild there. And it's interesting to think about the scale of those numbers, and also consider the fact that there are actually many species out there that are even in worse shape than the ones that we always hear about. For example, contrast 350,000 elephants to the fact that the Hainan black-crested gibbon, which is the most endangered primate in the world, is down to just 20 animals. Imagine as a human species, if there were just 10 guys and 10 ladies left in the world, it would be quite a dire situation. I'm sure we would all agree. Similarly, the northern sportive lemur of Madagascar, down to only 50 individuals left in the world. And this sort of thing can happen here in America as well, with the red wolf being one such species, down to perhaps 75. And so I draw those numbers out to illustrate what a wide range of situations endangered species may be facing globally. And oftentimes we find that there can be a mismatch between what people may be knowing about or focusing on and where efforts are going to save some of these. So we try and certainly apply many of our efforts into this species that have 1,000 individuals or less. And we find by doing that, we also help with groups that are working with larger charismatic megafauna as well. And I'd like to explain how over time here. But the other thing I like to convey is that animals, when they get this down to population levels like this, there's still absolutely hope for them. And a good example is a creature that we already talked about, which is the white rhino. In fact, if we had gone back in time to the 1890s and you wanted to see a white rhino, at the time it was thought those animals were extinct. And so you would have to go to a zoo, and you'd probably see a specimen that would look like this, and you could read about what a white rhino is like or was like. But it wasn't until a couple of hunters actually found a nascent population, and specifically 2 white rhinos, in a park in South Africa called Umfolozi. Now, what's interesting was that the thing that kept this population safe for so long was the tsetse fly, because people were afraid to go into this heavily bushed, heavily wilded area for fear of getting sleeping sickness. And so that kept the hunting pressures off of this very small population. So they quickly established one of the first parks on the continent of Africa, specifically for the preservation and recovery of white rhinos. And in the early 1900s, they did a survey and found that there was a nascent population left of about 20 animals. Over the next 40 or 50 years, they were able to grow that just through preservation means to a number of about 400. And that is when this man, Dr. Ian Player, got involved. And he said, hey, listen, this is on the way to being a fairly fantastic recovery story, but we literally have all of our proverbial eggs in one basket here. If there was a fire or a flood or a disease or some other type of what biologists refer to as stochastic event that could really wipe out the entire population, we would lose this species once again, and we can't let that happen. So he was incredibly innovative, and he got on his thinking cap, if you will, and he said, look, we can figure out how to dart and tranquilize and transport and reintroduce these animals, not only from Umfolozi to the rest of South Africa, but we can then reintroduce them back into their natural range habitats throughout sub-Saharan Africa as well. And in addition to that, we should not only transport them through the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, we should take them into zoos and safari parks and other nature reserves globally to essentially create insurance populations so that this species is never really at risk again. And with those efforts, he was able to work with the conservation community, and there are now an estimated number of 20,000 today. Now, that number is published several years ago, and it's unfortunately likely come down again due to increased hunting and poaching pressures that we'll talk a little bit about. But the reason I love this story is twofold. One is it shows an amazing conservation success case, and it tells us that the clever application of new methods and technologies can dramatically impact how species can be conserved for the heritage of our natural world and humanity. And that's part of what I would like to talk about as the focus of our organization, which is Wildlife Protection Solutions, and how we practically apply technology in support of conservation throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and increasingly this year into South America and other locations as well. So when we think of typically the issues faced by wildlife and people trying to conserve it, you think of things like habitat loss. You think of things like illegal trade of animals and poaching pressures that are associated with that. And another one that is often less well known is the issue of human-wildlife conflict, and the fact that if an animal is raiding into a village and destroying its crops, well, the villagers frequently will retaliate against that animal or those animals, and that leads to an escalating cycle of trouble between the two entities, which is very hard to circumvent and can lead to injuries and deaths on both sides, which is very terrible. So these are all areas that specifically we have deployed technology to kind of keep an eye on and work with local groups who have boots on the ground to alert them. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the different types of activities that we do and technologies that we deploy. Specifically, we focus on three kind of major areas. One being field sensors, which we'll talk much more about. Geospatial analysis is kind of the master set of tools that you can use in order to piece together a solid understanding of what's going on in a given protected area. And then you can marry that with intelligence gathering technologies to extend your intelligence and visibility of what's going on beyond the boundaries of a park into the surrounding communities, and work with them in understanding what threats may be there, what problems can you solve to alleviate pressures on wildlife. So turning our attention to field sensors, of course, we're probably all familiar with traditional protected areas. You know, you can imagine a big area on a map and it's marked, you know, national park or something like that. In many places around the world, that may or may not even include something that is fenced or not. In a lot of places globally, national lands and parks, even protected parks, are considered communal properties in many cases. And there's a certain amount of reliance that local communities have on these spaces for substantive aspects of their livelihoods, whether that's going and collecting firewood or different grass for grazing or things of that nature. It's oftentimes a very porous border, but in many cases it needs to be watched. And so one of the things that we'll frequently work with groups on doing is deploying different types of cameras, whether those involve real-time live video streams or some cameras that communicate through cellular means in various hotspots. Some groups are now deploying fence sensors where fences exist, so that if an electric fence drops its voltage because someone has climbed over it or shorted it out so they could pass through, there can be an appropriate alert. Many groups are using things like sound detection now. So if you can imagine a very large protected area and you've got a network of sensors that are designed to detect things like gunshots or chainsaws, that can be an early warning that poaching has occurred or people are illegally logging an area, and people can make an appropriate response to those types of intrusions. Another one is simply knowing where animals and ranger resources are. So tracking your vehicles, tracking airplanes, tracking ranger patrols over time, so that you can know who is closest to respond to a given incident. This also very much dramatically helps safety for the ranger teams as well. And then something new that we're seeing increasingly is the use of what some of you might have heard of as Internet of Things. These are devices that can sense a wide variety of different types of information, ranging from the water level in a water tank, to whether or not a gate has been left open, to the battery status of some solar panels that you may have. And each of those things can be rigged to specifically watch something that may be important to a protected area's operation and ongoing upkeep. So as you can imagine, you have a wide variety, essentially a net, if you will, of different types of sensors out there. And you need to, as a warden of a park, have some way to make sense of all of that information. And that's really where these geospatial tools come in. A couple that I would like to mention specifically is one called Earth Ranger, which we work to implement it in many types of protected areas globally. And this one is really designed to work hand in hand with the types of sensors that I just mentioned. So if you can imagine in the dashboard here, you know, tracking your rangers as they move through the park, tracking any animals that may be coming through, getting radio reports from the rangers that say shots fired at this direction. All of that can be tracked and analyzed over time. And another tool that goes hand in hand with this is a tool that is highly oriented toward the mobile data collection side called SMART. Oops. And that stands for Spatial Monitoring and Reporting Tool. And if you can imagine having your rangers with their mobile phones out, and if they see something like a cut in the fence or a track from a poacher or something like that, they can use their phones to quickly document what they need, take a picture, have the geo satellite tell them exactly where this occurred, and then that information can also be fed back into the central databases for future analytics that can inform where people should be patrolling, identifying hotspots that we're having troubles in, and that sort of thing. So these two tools are really the backbone of stitching everything together with regard to the field sensors and people being the eyes and ears of what's going on the ground. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of having some visibility into what's going on in the broader context of the community. Depending on where you are in the world, frequently we find that poaching and other wildlife crime may be related to syndicates trying to infiltrate the staff of these protected areas, paying significant bribes for information about where patrols are and when, or where key animals are that are highly interesting for people to try and take either for poaching or the pet trade or other things. And so frequently we're seeing more and more polygraphs being used in some locations to identify potential suspects. But we're also seeing a significant uptick in the number of people who are using intelligence databases create these mind maps. So a good example of this might be if, for example, an intruder is caught in a protected area and his cell phone is confiscated. These intelligence database systems can allow you to enter in the various contacts in there, and eventually you create a net of exactly what this criminal syndicate may look like. You can also be tracking things like what vehicles people are using, what firearms, and this is something that's very important for wardens to work with official police authorities to share information and identify how to sort of quickly target specific criminal elements that can have a positive impact if they're picked up in reducing wildlife crime. So I'd like to take a bit of a step back and explain how the idea of this whole system works. In our case, as I mentioned, it typically starts with something like a field sensor, oftentimes a camera that we'll deploy into a protected area. And we make sure that that camera can communicate in real time, usually by connecting it through the local cellular networks. Or if that's not available, we'll establish our own private repeater networks through private radio towers, or sometimes even use long-range point-to-point Wi-Fi. But once we can get this information out, because so much data is generated by all of these different types of field sensors, we'll typically run that through a set of machine learning or threat detection routines. And so these routines can absolutely be on the lookout for us 24/7 for things like vehicles where they shouldn't be at nighttime, or people intruding into protected areas where they don't belong, or even on the scientific and ecological side of things, they can be used to identify animals. So if groups are specifically keeping an eye for individuals or trying to track movements of animals, we can send customized alerts based on that. But once we've identified something that is important to alert on, the next question becomes, where do we need to send that? And due to the global nature of our world now, the answer is quite happily anywhere we need to. But typically that starts with the people who are able to respond on the ground most rapidly, the first responders or the local rangers. Frequently, we'll also be concurrently sending those messages to a joint operations center or a local ranger station where these things are monitored 24/7. But we also take this a step farther and take advantage of the fact that the daytime here in Denver is the middle of the night in Southeast Asia and often early evening when poachers are active in Africa. And we'll monitor these same data feeds from our location here in Denver to keep an eye on things as yet another group to help with these efforts. And we take this even one step farther by opening up, if a protected area will allow it, these same feeds to groups of volunteers who can monitor this type of information on their cell phones through a simple web portal that we've created. So you may be asking, how does this all kind of work? And I'm pleased to report in a couple of neat ways that I'd like to walk through here. The first is this can create an incredible connection for the user between our daily lives here in the proverbial concrete jungle and what's going on around the world in a very wild space. For example, one day I was looking at our feeds and I noticed this antelope, which is in a very unusual position, let's say. You know, its legs are kind of splayed out. It looks a little bit, to my eye, freaked out. And so I said, that's interesting. I'm going to watch this feed for a little while. And a few minutes later, another image came in of a herd definitely on the move. And 2 minutes after that, I hope this can show up on all of your screens, but the third image came through, and there's the eye shine and body outline of a leopard there hunting at this water hole. So that little vignette of images was pretty amazing to see in real time from around the world and say, wow, that's literally happening right now in Africa. That leopard is on the hunt. But from a more practical standpoint, we have deployed cameras into extremely remote areas of protected zones. And one morning, this allowed us to really gather what the military refers to pattern of life information quite quickly. So for example, this fellow one day came in about 6 a.m. to the protected area. And we were on the phone with the warden and said, is this a ranger? Do you know who this is? He said, no, we need to keep an eye on it. I can't dispatch people right now because it's very far away, but let's make note of it. The next day he was there, same time, same place, this time with a friend and clearly doing some tracking of animals. And on the third day we said, okay, we understand his pattern now. So we coordinated with the local warden. They set up what they refer to as a lie-in-wait situation. They repositioned the cameras, and when they came in the fourth day to do this illegal poaching, we were actually able to get the chase on film and see it happening, and they were able to make the arrests. So really, there's a lot of value in being able to gather this type of pattern of life information very, very quickly. Another good example that I like to provide of how these real-time sensors can impact wildlife crime in a positive way came from a protected area that was bordering on an area that had a lot of incursions from a local village. And they asked us, because they had rhinos specifically on this property, to come in and identify points of interest where we thought people would be intruding from. And so we identified several, including one that was a bridge that people were sure to cross if they needed to get to the core habitat of these animals. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, we saw 2 spotters on the cameras, followed by a gunman. Now, interestingly, this all happened at about 2 in the morning local time. And because this park was a smaller one, they didn't have a 24-hour response center. But one of our volunteers based here in Denver actually saw this image on the app, and they were able to contact us, and through the standard procedures that we had already established with the warden, we got back in touch and they were able to activate the rhino protection teams. And no kidding, within 15 minutes, we saw the response teams on the cameras, heavily armed, as you can see, and in pursuit of these poachers. This actually resulted in a firefight between the two, which prompted the poaching team to flee the area, but they did drop all of their weapons and all of their supplies, and we were even able to see the post-crime scene analysis happening in real time as well. So the reason I love to tell this story is because in many cases, conservation feels like something that's very far away and the problems are not ours, and it's not anything that we can do about. But here in this instance specifically, because of the sharp eye and quick actions of a person here in Denver, she saved the life of rhinos halfway around the world. And that's the sort of thing that technology can enable with conservation today. The other thing that my group does and puts a heavy focus on is education and outreach, because we feel that the more people we can bring into the love of the outdoors and wildlife, even though it's somewhat difficult in the age of coronavirus, we spend a lot of time collecting 3D footage of these animals that can be viewed in virtual reality headsets. Because what we're trying to do is encourage more people to not only see animals in zoos, but experience them as they might in a wild setting, which is something that we've specialized in, being able to capture them with no humans around. And so you really get a feel for what these animals are like. So that involves sending teams out into very wild places with specialized equipment. We also do a lot of filming of docent and educational leader activities. And increasingly, we are trying to find out how to spend more of our filming efforts capturing important things that need to be conveyed to other people, like veterinary procedures for wildlife as well. Because the 360 virtual reality mechanism can make you feel almost like you're there. So it's a way of really bringing people new experiences that they otherwise can't have in some of the most moving and amazing ways that you can experience short of actually being there. And so with that said, I believe that brings me to my final slide. And shall I open the floor up to questions?
Yes, stop screen sharing and open up the floor to questions.
Oh my gosh. I have 1,000 questions, Eric, and I am very excited about the technology here. I'm a 30-year monitoring specialist. I just got done with Raytheon and all the satellites up there for GPS OCX. As far as the technology, I have, hundreds of questions regarding, the SNMP, are you using ADWE, or all these technical questions that I'd love to throw out there and, talk with your technicians as well. And also was wondering if you had any aspirations for openings for people that can assist, whether it be volunteer or.
Yes, certainly. We kind of have an open door policy with regard to people wanting to get involved. There's a variety of ways to doing that, ranging from the simple, most basic end to simply monitoring the app, all the way through helping us on the technical sides with questions that we might have regarding technologies that could be beneficial, or even joining us to go out on trips and help, climb in the trees and hang the sensors and help with the training of the ground staff and things like that. So wide range of conversations to have there. And I'd love to follow up with you, Sam.
Yes. And the filming as well. Virtual reality has been my latest endeavor, and I'll send you samples and all of that kind of stuff, and we'll talk later.
Great.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have one, Eric. In the New York Magazine, maybe a month ago, there was a story about the northern white last two northern white rhinos. And then it was also on the Daily, probably about the same time. It was just an amazingly moving and tragic story. Do you have, when we talk about the numbers of rhinos or elephants, which seem huge by comparison to a species that only has 20 living members, that large number incorporates all of the rhinos, right? Not just the white rhino or what other?
Yeah, the white rhino is, if you look at the International Union for Conservation of Nature's latest publication, they say it's about 20,000, and that's only for that one species.
Oh.
There are about 4,000 black rhino left. The northern white, which you just mentioned, is actually a subspecies of the of the white rhino in general. So the white rhino is nominally divided between northern white, of which there's those two individuals left, but it's functionally extinct because they're both female. And then the southern white is kind of the remainder there. Interestingly, there are around 3,000 greater one-horned rhino, or what we would often think of as Indian rhinos. And then the ones that we spend a lot of time trying to help with are the Javan rhino, which are only found in one park right off the coast of Krakatoa, of which there are about 64 individuals left. And the Sumatran rhino, which is in only really 2 parks left in the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. And there may be, they don't even know, but it's estimated between 80 and 100 of those left. So more rhinos than people know about, and in very difficult positions in many cases.
Thank you.
Ned.
I have a question, Eric. Just in general, how do you feel like the progress is being made in general about saving a lot of these species? Obviously, your efforts are helping a lot, but are we turning the curve in the right direction?
No. I hate to say that.
Yeah.
I feel like every year there's we sort of continue to ring fence land for the animals, and that ring fence gets a little bit shrunken more and more. The efforts I do see are that people are trying to do a better job of protecting the lands that are being identified, and in some cases, through very hard work, you can see turnaround stories like the white rhino that I mentioned early on. But I feel like we lose species each year. Unfortunately, we also discover new species each year, which is exciting. But we're placing the planet under incredible pressures right now.
Okay. Okay, one more question. Anybody?
No,
Martin.
Yeah, the question that I have, and thank you very much, is I have heard as well that the pandemic has been affecting conservation efforts worldwide immensely. Could you share for a moment or two as to how the pandemic has been interfacing with your conservation techniques?
Absolutely. I'd like to take a bit of a step back actually and address it from a much broader perspective, because our group focuses very tightly on technology, which has actually helped in the context of the pandemics, but it's in a bad scenario. So many of the global spaces that are set aside for wildlife thrive on tourism, and it's those dollars that go through various mechanisms into supporting the rangers and the patrols and things that keep the poachers out. And a group that we specifically work quite closely with in the Masai Mara has had their revenues slashed by 90% since this whole thing started. And as an organization, I'm proud to say that our board has found it appropriate to take some of what would be our endowment and try and push those into various conservation efforts direct on the ground to just keep the wheels on because of this lack of tourism. So those groups that are, on the front lines are hurting in an incredibly bad way. And concurrent with this, with the global collapse of the economies, we've seen more people say, look, I'm going to turn to subsistence hunting and bushmeat poaching and things of that nature, illegal means of trying to provide for my family. So concurrent with the collapse of ranger support, we've seen a spike in people being interested in poaching, and it's made for very, very difficult times for conservation globally with the virus.
Okay. Myrna.
So a couple of us in the Lions Club, actually the other folks aren't on, I don't see today, but had through a nonprofit fundraiser tickets before the pandemic as part of a charitable organization to visit a reserve in South Africa. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you the name. If Steve were on, he could. But so it has me wondering, I'm not very knowledgeable, but I wondered are there specific reserves that you work with in Africa?
Yes, we actually work with quite a number of both reserves as well as national recognized protected areas and national parks. But we're open to working with many others through a variety of different models.
And I was just curious, but what some of them were. I might
Oh,
not
my
know them, but I know some.
Yeah, the list is up to 50 or more. I mean, many of the big ones around Kruger, Sabi Sand, down in more toward Durban, Finda, Timbavati, Manuletti. This all gets very insider baseball. There's a lot of them. The chances are we may be working with the ones you might be familiar with.
Okay.
Myrna, and the one that you were going to is next door or close to one of the ones that Eric mentioned, but I don't think it's on that one.
Okay. Okay. So we can wrap it up. Eric, thank you so much. That is actually truly amazing, actually, that we're helping conservation on the other side of the world. The video, that technology is a wonderful thing. Most of the time, except when you try to enter a Zoom meeting and can't get in.
Very good.
All right.